The story I'll tell you isn't one I like to remember. It started with boredom and ended with terror. If you've ever ventured into the deep web, you might understand the blend of intrigue and danger that draws you in deeper than you thought possible. For anyone who hasn't, this isn't some game. The deep web is full of things that shouldn't exist, things that leave a mark on you. It began innocently enough. I'd been reading about the deep web for weeks, lurking in forums, listening to horror stories about strange websites, chat rooms where people posted horrible secrets, and even some alleged live shows. They say that once you go looking, you'll eventually find something you wish you hadn't. I shrugged it off at first, curious to see how much of it was real. So one night, I downloaded Tor, dimmed my lights, and started my descent into the hidden web. At first, it was underwhelming. Black backgrounds, outdated forum boards, generic conspiracy theories. But then I found something more ominous. A forum for people seeking experiences. Experiences people don't talk about in polite company. A shiver went down my spine, and I was ready to click away until a private message popped up. It read, "Want something real?" Message back. Curiosity got the better of me, and I typed, "Sure, I'm interested." There was no response for hours. I thought I'd been brushed off until late that night, around 2 a.m., when a link arrived in my inbox with a simple warning, "Be prepared for what you see." The website looked simple at first, plain, dark, with just a few scattered links. The first few were tame, just forums filled with ghost stories and urban legends. But one link in particular caught my eye. It was labeled Spectator Room. The description beneath it was brief. "Watch only. Do not engage." I clicked. The page loaded slowly, almost painfully, and what appeared was a live video feed from what looked like a dark, dingy room. The quality was grainy, barely enough to make out details. A single chair sat in the middle of the room, dimly lit by a swinging bulb. Nothing happened for several minutes, and just as I was about to close out, the door creaked open. A person entered, a man in a black hooded coat, face obscured. He dragged something behind him, something large and wrapped in plastic. My heart was racing, and part of me wanted to close the browser and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't stop watching. I was locked in place, breath shallow, as the man unwrapped the plastic to reveal a human figure, unconscious and bound. He took his time, working meticulously. The person on the floor began to wake up, their eyes wide with terror as they realized where they were. I wanted to scream for them, to do something, but I remembered the warning, "Do not engage." Besides, how could I? I didn't know where they were, who they were. I was just a spectator. The man in the coat turned, almost as if sensing my presence, his face still hidden in shadow. It felt like he was staring through the screen, straight at me, and I froze, heart pounding. Then he turned away and resumed what he was doing. For the next few minutes, the screen was a blur of movement. I won't describe the details of what he did, but I'll say this. I've seen things I'll never unsee. Horrific things. The figure on the ground, they stopped moving long before he did. And then he paused, standing up and facing the camera, staring into the lens as if looking right into my soul. I could feel his eyes on me, a smirk on his lips that was somehow more unsettling than anything else I'd seen. Slowly, he reached out a gloved hand and typed something on a small laptop that must have been in the room. And then, as the words popped up on my screen, my blood ran cold. "I see you." My screen went black. I scrambled, trying to restart my laptop, unplugging it, pressing every key. When it finally restarted, there was no sign of the website or the link. I checked my inbox, my history, every trace of the session, all gone. It was as if I'd imagined the whole thing. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. All I could see was that room, that person on the floor, that man's smirk. Every time I closed my eyes, the words, "I see you," echoed in my mind. It was days before I could bring myself to even look at my laptop again, and weeks before I felt remotely safe. A few months later, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in large, neat letters. "I'm still watching. I moved cities, changed everything about my online presence, never went near the deep web again. And still, sometimes I feel eyes on me when I'm alone. Presence, just waiting for me to turn my back." When I bought my house, the basement was a major selling point. It was massive, with enough room to set up a game area, a movie corner, maybe even a small bar. The realtor had only briefly mentioned that the house had a quirky history, but it was a great price, and I didn't think twice. The basement had an old, narrow staircase leading down into the dark, and the air got heavier with each step. It felt odd, like the walls were pressing in slightly, and the darkness down there seemed denser than usual. I laughed it off, chalking it up to nerves and dust, and flicked on the old light hanging from a chain in the center of the ceiling. It cast weak, flickering light, just enough to see the shadows clinging to the corners. The first few months went by quietly. I started fixing up the house, mostly ignoring the basement aside from a few boxes of old stuff I kept down there. But one night, while working late in my home office, I heard something strange, a noise from the basement. It sounded faint, like something dragging slowly across the floor. My heart raced, but I tried to calm myself down. It was probably just a rodent or something, maybe something shifting in one of the boxes. Still, the sound lingered for far too long. I went downstairs with a flashlight. The basement was as empty as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, just as I was about to leave, I noticed something odd. One of the walls had small scratches on it, faint but distinct. I hadn't seen them before, and they formed what looked like the beginnings of some kind of symbol. My stomach twisted, but I tried to brush it off, thinking it must have been there before, or maybe just a weird crack in the paint. I told myself to forget about it and went back upstairs. But the noises didn't stop. Every night, it was something different. Footsteps, whispers, and that horrible dragging sound, always coming from the basement. I convinced myself it was my imagination, but after a week of it, I had to go back down. The flashlight wobbled in my hand as I walked down the steps, and this time, I felt an icy chill in the air, like something was watching me. The scratches on the wall had grown. They formed a clearer shape now, something circular with jagged lines. That's when I noticed the door. I had never seen it before, tucked into the farthest corner, barely visible in the shadows. I knew this basement was supposed to be a single room, but there it was, an old metal door with no handle, just rust and grime clinging to its edges. My first instinct was to leave it alone, to run back upstairs and forget about it, but curiosity won. I gave it a push, and to my surprise, it creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. I hesitated, but I couldn't resist taking a step inside. The room was smaller, with low ceilings, and the smell was overwhelming. A damp, rotting stench that made my stomach turn. I was about to leave when something on the floor caught my eye. It was an old, worn-down notebook, lying open as though someone had just set it down. I picked it up, the pages stiff and faded, filled with scrawled handwriting. I started reading, and the deeper I went, the colder I felt. The entries were disturbing, like the ramblings of someone losing their mind. Whoever wrote them seemed obsessed with the idea of someone, or something, trapped in the basement. The words, "Keep it down there," were written over and over, each entry more frantic than the last. The final entry was different. It simply read, "I hear it scratching. It's coming closer. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the weak light went out. I was plunged into darkness. Heart racing, I tried to find my way back, but as I reached out, my hand brushed against something cold and solid, a wall. The doorway was gone. Panic flooded me as I realized the walls felt different, closer somehow. It was as if the room itself was changing around me. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I was back in the main basement, but something was wrong. The basement didn't look like it had when I'd first bought the house. The walls were cracked and peeling, covered in those same scratches and strange symbols I'd seen before. And in the corner, the metal door was wide open again. But this time, I heard something breathing. I felt like I was losing my mind, trapped in some nightmarish version of my basement, hearing footsteps echo all around me. I ran up the stairs, but the door to the main floor wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, screaming, but no one heard. My phone flickered, the battery draining faster than it should, and in the dim light, I saw a figure emerging from the shadows, dragging itself slowly, painfully toward me. It was a person, or what was left of one. Their clothes were tattered, skin pale and stretched tight, eyes hollow and black. They crawled, dragging a twisted leg behind them, and as they got closer, I saw their mouth opening, letting out a raspy, guttural whisper. "Help me?" I scrambled back, too scared to move, too terrified to scream. I watched, frozen, as they crept closer, their bony hand reaching out toward me. But just before they touched me, they stopped, their heads snapping up to stare at something behind me. The door to the room was wide open, and through it, I could see the dark shape of something even worse. A tall, shadowy figure with no face, only an endless void where its eyes should have been. The thing in front of me let out a strangled scream and began dragging itself back, trying to escape, but it was too late. The shadow figure stepped into the room, its presence swallowing the light, consuming everything in darkness. I don't remember what happened next. I must have passed out because when I woke up, I was lying at the top of the basement stairs, the metal door gone, the basement back to its normal, empty self. I left that house the same day, never returned. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The scratching, faint but insistent, as if something is trying to claw its way back up from beneath my feet. And every so often, I'll wake up with the same words echoing in my mind. I hear it scratching. It's coming closer. This is the kind of story I would have laughed off, maybe even shared as an exaggerated joke with friends a few years ago. But after what happened to me, I'm no longer so quick to dismiss haunted basement tales or stories about the deep web. It all started with an old house I'd inherited from my great-uncle, whom I barely knew. He'd lived alone in a tiny, forgotten town, and his house was ancient, dark, with creaking floors and small, dusty rooms that smelled faintly of mildew and old books. I'd planned to stay there only a few days, just long enough to clean up and figure out what to do with it. But on the first night, while I was settling in, I found an old laptop tucked away in the closet of the guest room. It looked completely out of place, old, almost antique-looking, with a bulky build that hadn't been popular for at least a decade. It wouldn't even turn on, so I plugged it in and let it charge while I continued to explore the house. That's when I noticed the basement. The door was old, painted the same dark color as the walls, and I almost missed it at first. I don't know what it was, but something about it felt off. It wasn't locked, so I slowly opened it, only to be greeted by a draft of cold, stale air that made my skin prickle. The stairs were steep and narrow, disappearing into pitch-black darkness below. The basement light switch didn't work, so I pulled out my phone flashlight and began my descent, curiosity outweighing my nerves. First, it seemed empty. Just an ordinary basement with a low ceiling, crumbling brick walls, and a damp, musty smell. But as I scanned the walls with my flashlight, I noticed something odd. A huge, dark stain near the far corner. It was thick and black like dried tar or maybe old blood. My stomach churned as I approached it, and I could swear the air got colder. A feeling of unease washed over me, so strong that I could almost hear it whispering to me, telling me to leave. I went back upstairs, shutting the basement door behind me, telling myself it was just a stain, just an old house with strange quirks. I returned to the guest room, where the laptop had finally powered on. To my surprise, it booted up quickly despite its age, opening to a plain desktop with a single icon labeled, "Don't open." Of course, curiosity got the better of me. I double-clicked. What I found was a maze of strange files and folders, most of them containing text documents filled with incoherent ramblings, fragments of journal entries, and something that looked like a list of names. It was disturbing, but I kept reading, growing more uncomfortable with each page. The entries were all from different people, each writing about a hidden door in the basement, a door they could never find again after seeing it for the first time. The entries grew darker, with the writers describing strange visions, dark figures, and a constant, gnawing feeling that something was watching them. They wrote about how they'd heard whispers and scratching sounds, how they'd wake up to find the basement door open, despite locking it before bed. One entry, dated nearly 20 years ago, ended abruptly with, "I hear it coming up the stairs. It knows I've been reading this. If anyone finds this, get out." As I read, I heard a faint creaking sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from the basement. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. There it was again, like someone slowly, methodically climbing the stairs, each step heavy and deliberate. My throat went dry as I glanced at the basement door, and to my horror, I saw that it was slightly ajar. Swallowing hard, I crept over to it, pushing it closed and locking it. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any further sounds. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination fueled by the eerie entries I'd been reading. But even after I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something on the other side was listening back. The next night, I decided to try to learn more about the laptop. I'd heard about strange websites and chat rooms you could only access through the deep web, and it felt like this laptop had been purposefully set up for something like that. I downloaded Tor and started exploring, but almost immediately, things felt wrong. The first few links I clicked on led to forums discussing doorways and rituals, people asking for help because they couldn't escape. Then I found a link to a live chat room. Against my better judgment, I entered. At first, the chat was empty except for one username, Watcher in the Dark. I stared at the screen, waiting, and after a few minutes, a message popped up. "You've seen it, haven't you?" My fingers froze over the keyboard. It was as if they knew exactly what I'd read, what I'd experienced. I typed, "Who are you?" but got no response. After a few minutes of silence, I typed, "What is in the basement?" There was a long pause before they finally replied. "It lives in the dark. It waits. Don't go back down there." I tried to ask more questions, but the chat suddenly closed. The laptop screen went black, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't turn it back on. Frustrated and scared, I unplugged it, deciding to leave it and the entire basement alone for the rest of my stay. That night, I was woken by the sound of scratching. Slow, methodical, as if something was dragging its claws against wood. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just a raccoon or a stray cat, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, echoing up from below. Then I heard a soft creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the basement stairs. Each step was slow, calculated, moving closer and closer to the door. My heart pounded as I stared at the door, willing it to stay shut. Just as I began to relax, there was a loud bang, as if something heavy had thrown itself against the door. I bolted out of bed, grabbing my phone, dialing 911. I told the operator I thought someone had broken into the house, and they promised to send help right away. The banging continued, each thud rattling the door, until suddenly it stopped. Silence filled the air, and I crept toward the basement door, pressing my ear against it, hoping that whatever was down there had gone. But as I leaned closer, I heard a faint whisper, so quiet that I almost missed it. "Let me in." The police arrived a few minutes later, and after explaining what I'd heard, they agreed to check the basement. They went down, their flashlights cutting through the dark, and I waited in tense silence, hoping they'd find something, anything that could explain what was happening. But when they came back up, they looked at me like I was crazy. "There's nothing down there," one of them said. "Just an empty basement." I sold the house a week later, but every once in a while, late at night, I wake up to a strange sound, a scratching noise, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I can hear a faint whisper, "Let me in." I'll never forget the day I stumbled into the mess that turned my life into a waking nightmare. If I'd known what I was getting into, I'd have thrown that old laptop out, left that basement door sealed, and never thought twice about it. But hindsight's a cruel teacher, and curiosity is the worst kind of curse. It started innocently enough. My best friend, Kyle, and I were looking to save on rent, so we moved into this cheap, old house that we found on an auction site. It was a bit out of the way, had more cobwebs than furniture, and creaked with every gust of wind. The basement, though, that basement was an entirely different beast. From the moment we moved in, I felt like something was wrong with it. It wasn't just the smell, though the stale, earthy odor was intense. It was like an itch at the back of my mind, telling me to stay away, to leave it alone. Kyle laughed it off, calling me a wimp and daring me to check it out. "What's a little dirt and darkness?" he'd say. "Besides, it's probably just storage junk down there." On our second night in the house, we lost power during a thunderstorm, so we were forced to use flashlights and candles. I'd just gotten comfortable on the couch when Kyle came in, grinning and waving an old laptop he'd found in the basement. It looked ancient, clunky, with dull silver casing and a cracked screen. Oddly enough, there was a piece of tape over the camera with "Do not remove" scribbled in a frantic scrawl. Kyle, being Kyle, immediately ripped it off and started messing with the thing. It took hours to boot up, but eventually, it flashed to life with a dim glow. The laptop's desktop was nearly empty, except for one folder sitting right in the center of the screen, ominously titled, "Do not open." Naturally, we opened it. The folder was filled with dozens of strange files. Some were PDFs, others text documents, a few images. I opened one of the PDFs, which looked like a bunch of medical records. The names had been redacted, but each record described patients with severe mental distress, people reporting hallucinations, insomnia, and paranoia. One patient claimed they saw something lurking in the darkness of their basement. Another said they'd heard voices calling their name, telling them to come down. Kyle and I exchanged a glance, each too proud to admit the other might be right to feel nervous. But neither of us could stop reading. The files got stranger as we continued. We found text files that seemed to be personal journals, entries from random strangers, each more disturbing than the last. People describing vivid, terrifying dreams, feeling like they were being watched, and seeing shadowy figures just out of sight. One journal was particularly unsettling. It was titled "The Basement Door" and written like a step-by-step guide, detailing how to find a door that only opens at night down in the basement. And then there were the pictures. We only clicked on one. It was a photo of what looked like an old, wooden basement door, slightly ajar, with a faint light seeping through the crack. But it was the reflection in the glass next to the door that caught my eye. There was a figure, shadowy and distorted, watching from the darkness. "Dude, we should delete this," I said, half joking and half dead serious. Kyle shrugged it off. "It's just someone's weird art project," he said, but there was tension in his voice, like he was convincing himself. I wanted to stop there, but something kept drawing us back. Over the next few nights, we started hearing strange sounds. At first, it was faint, almost ignorable. But then, as if emboldened by our silence, the sounds grew louder. Scratching noises like something clawing at wood, sometimes followed by faint whispers that sounded like they were coming from underneath us. One night, as I lay in bed with my eyes closed, I heard it. A whisper, clear as day, calling my name. I shot up, heart hammering, but the house was silent. The next morning, Kyle looked worse than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale, and he was muttering something about a door. I tried to shake it out of him, but he just brushed me off and said he hadn't slept. That night, I heard him creeping down the stairs, heard the soft click of the basement door opening. I called after him, but there was no response. So I grabbed my flashlight and followed. I found him standing in the middle of the basement, staring at the far wall, where an old, splintered door I'd never noticed before was now hanging open. A faint glow leaked from the crack, casting strange shadows across Kyle's face. "Hey man, are you okay?" I whispered, not wanting to break whatever trance he was in. He looked back at me, eyes unfocused, like he was looking right through me. "It wants me to come in," he said, voice hollow. "It wants both of us." I felt a chill creep down my spine. Every instinct told me to run, to drag Kyle out and leave that house for good. But my feet stayed rooted to the ground. The next thing I knew, I was following him through that door. The moment we stepped inside, everything changed. The basement fell away, replaced by narrow, twisted hallways that seemed to stretch on forever, lined with doors. Some were open, leading to rooms filled with shadows and whispers. Others were shut tight, their handles cold and damp to the touch. As we walked, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, calling my name, pleading, warning, taunting. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my eyes, slithering along the walls, reaching out with twisted, skeletal fingers. Every door we passed felt like it was watching us, waiting for us to open it. We walked for what felt like hours, each step taking us deeper into the maze. Kyle was still ahead of me, moving faster, as if pulled by some invisible force. I tried to call out to him, tried to tell him to stop, but my voice came out as a hoarse whisper, lost in the cacophony of voices around us. And then, finally, we reached the last door. It was taller than the others, painted a sickly green, with strange symbols carved into the wood. The air around it was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Kyle reached for the handle, and I tried to stop him, tried to pull him back, but he slipped through my fingers. As the door creaked open, a darkness unlike anything I'd ever seen spilled out, swallowing him whole. I reached in, grabbing blindly, but all I felt was cold, empty air. I called his name, but there was no response, only silence. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and the door slammed shut in my face. The hallways around me began to shift, twisting and warping, the doors merging and disappearing, until I was left standing alone in the darkness. Somehow, I made it back to the basement, though I don't remember how. The door was gone, and Kyle was nowhere to be found. I searched the house, called his name, but there was nothing. Just an empty, silent house with a laptop that refused to turn on. I left that night, didn't look back. I reported him missing, but nothing ever came of it. The police searched the house, but they found no trace of Kyle. No basement door, no strange laptop. It was like he'd never existed. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear it. That faint, scratching sound like something clawing at wood. And every now and then, I think I hear his voice calling my name, begging me to come back down. And I wonder if I'd still find that door waiting for me.
From the summer of 2021 to 2022, I was a lifeguard at a small beach called Adams Point Beach, which is located in Quechee Lake, New York. I didn't really enjoy my job, to be honest, besides making friends with the other lifeguards. I wasn't getting paid enough money, and my final paycheck of the summer of 2021 was $350. To make matters even more difficult, I come from a family with no money. I live in a farm and my parents fight with each other a lot. I never went to college, because my family can't afford it, so I have to work 2 jobs every day. One from 9 to 5 and the other from 6 to 11, where I only get paid $15 an hour. In the summer of 2022, my boss, for whatever reason, had demoted me to a sub-lifeguard. This really pissed me off because I couldn't see my friends. One day in August of 2022, I was called in to substitute for a lifeguard, as this lifeguard was busy that day and only one other lifeguard was available. Usually there are 3 lifeguards, but that day was a shortage of staff. The start of that day was like how a day would usually start. Unfortunately, that changed in the afternoon. My 30-minute shift on the lifeguard chair was done and the other lifeguard swapped with me. I walked back to the shed and went inside of it. About 10 minutes later, while I was on my phone, I heard a bunch of screaming and crying outside of the shed with the door closed. I didn't know what was going on, so I walked outside. What I saw next is an image that I will never unsee for the rest of my life. What I saw was the lifeguard along with 4 other people have a woman on a surf rescue board with both of her legs severed off. I felt petrified, but I had to help the other lifeguard as it was my job to save people. I helped carry the surfboard, but I looked behind me as it was so brutal to look at what was in front of me. I helped everyone place the board on a table with the woman laying on it right next to the shed. Thankfully, the police and medics were already called. I asked what had happened. One guy said, a guy by himself in a speedboat wasn't looking where he was driving his boat and people told him to stop and slow down, but he was in his own world. He then ran over the woman, then would come to a stop like 3 seconds later. Then, he apparently took off like a coward would do. I could not believe what I was hearing. I then told the man to describe what the speedboat looked like. I asked him this because this was a very small lake and I pretty much know everyone who comes to this lake and lives right next to it. He said it was a blue jet boat. When the man told me this, I felt as if my whole world was coming to an end. That is my dad's boat. He is the only one who owns a jet boat on this lake. I then saw everything turn blurry and then it all went to black. I then woke up to 2 EMTs side by side next to me. They asked if I was alright. I told them I was fine and then I went to go grab my water bottle and then drank the water as if I had never drunk water before in my life. I then exited the beach area as my boss told everyone to go home because of what happened today. I got in my car and I drove home, which was about 3 to 4 minutes away. As I got home, I turned off my car, stepped out to see my dad pacing back and forth nervously through the kitchen window. I then rushed inside of the house and I went on a full rampage to my father. I confronted him and then called him a pussy for leaving the scene of the accident. He was breathing so hard. I had never seen him breathing like this ever before. As I was still yelling at him and my adrenaline was kicking in more than ever before, I shoved him, then starting hitting him. He told me to calm the fuck down. After about 10 hits, I finally pushed him to his full limits and he punched me so hard that I fell to the ground and my ears were ringing. He then yelled at me to "Stay the f down, you stupid little bit," before running out of the house and speeding off somewhere. I continued to bawl my eyes out. I was never close with my dad. I never came to him for help when needed, but never in a million years would I thought he would end up doing something so horrific. About an hour and a half later, my mother finally came home after going to the hospital to check on the woman who my father had injured. As my mother walked through the door, she hugged me for which it felt like an eternity and we cried together. We sat down together at the dinner table and she told me some good news and bad news. The good news is that the woman is alive and okay. The bad news is that she had to get both of her legs amputated off of her and have it be replaced with bionic legs. I felt so relieved that she survived, but I was still so devastated that my father took off, never even apologized and never came to see the woman in the hospital. My mother asked me where did my husband go. I told my mom that he took off. We tried calling him but it went straight to voicemail. The police were called again and we filed a missing persons report on my dad. The next few weeks the police tried searching everywhere for him and came up empty-handed. It was the worst 3 weeks of my life. I quit my job straight after due to the traumatic sight I have seen on that very day. I have been seeing a psychologist 3 times a week now. Each day I was very slowly starting to get better and better, but I still have a long way to go. I also only work one job now and have been promoted at my job, which now I get paid $25 an hour. This makes me happier as I still have some luck in this world. I still have not seen my father since. I don't really miss him that much after he attacked me and called me a. I wish I can tell you that the story ends here, but sadly it does not and the next part gets even worse. Fast forwarding to sometime in mid-July, during this past summer of 2024, I decided to go kayaking at 7 o'clock at night. I wanted to exercise my brain and I needed some free time for myself. I took off in my kayak. I kayaked in the area of around 30 feet deep, then kayaking to the shallower area. My destination to stop was at a land area to walk on it and to take a break from kayaking as my arms were getting sore. During this whole time kayaking, I looked at the water beneath me. As I got to around 15 feet deep, what I saw on the bottom of the ground underneath the water was textbook horror. I saw a dead body of an old woman. I paddled out of there so fast and then reaching to my destination that I originally planned to go. After pulling my kayak to shore, I ran into the grass area and threw up around 5 times. Luckily, I had my phone on me so I called 911. The police came 10 minutes later. About 7 cop cars showed up along with a SWAT team. I gave them my story and they told me to evacuate the area as it will be going under investigation. About 2 weeks later, we got some of the worst news ever. More worse news than anyone who lived in my town had ever gotten before. The detective told us that this person was murdered. They also traced DNA fingerprints to find out who the perpetrator is and it worked. When they revealed who the killer was, I was nowhere near prepared to find out who it would be. It was my estranged father. Why the hell would he come back to this town if his main goal was to try to escape this town? I couldn't think of any motive of why he would kill this person. This was so devastating that the next day, I packed most of my clothes and drove off all the way downstate to New York City. I needed a break from this so-called curse that is going on upstate in my hometown. I stayed in New York City for about 3 weeks in a cheap hotel, then came back. The police, this time along with the FBI, searched again for my father and yet again, nothing. I quit my job after this, and now I am unemployed. Luckily, I have my little sister who had just graduated high school, take over for me. As you are hearing this story as of now, there is still no updates on where my father could possibly be. He could be living in another state far away, or maybe he could have fled the country. I never went to see my father ever again after hearing that he murdered another human being. If there is more news revolving around this case, I will keep you posted.